Dr. Carveth, Don. He said it's okay to call him Don.
Please do.
We welcome you. So please join us.
Thank you, Patricia. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you online, although it would be better yet if we were together in Michigan, but hopefully one day that kind of thing will be possible again. I originally wrote this for several years ago when we first were going to present, and I'm afraid in my paper I didn't change the title, so just to let you know that's why. Okay, as Patricia said, the paper is called Psychoanalysis is Spirituality. No need to draw comparisons between psychoanalysis, although it's interesting to do so, but what we have in common, we ourselves are a spiritual tradition, a spiritual practice, and a spiritual enterprise in my view. In the 2013 book, The Still Small Voice, I argued that psychoanalysis is and always has been an ethical practice, despite our attempts to disguise the fact. We have always stood for life over death, love over hate, and truth over lies. Our therapy has always involved an albeit subtle and tactful attempt to help patients evolve psychologically, an effort to facilitate their progression from narcissism to object love, as Freud said in 1914, and from paranoid schizoid, PS, persecutory anxiety and shame, to a depressive reparative D, capacity for concern for the other, and for mature reparative guilt, as Klein, Winnicott, Grinberg, and others have taught us. This evolution that we promote in our therapeutic practice is tantamount to what in the psychology of religion is a conversion. Oh no, people are saying, is Carveth actually saying that we analysts are out to convert people? Of course we're out to convert people. From narcissism to object love, from paranoid schizoid functioning to depressive reparative position functioning. Okay, we're in the conversion business, I believe. On narcissism, Freud wrote, quotes, "In the last resort, we must begin to love in order to not to fall ill, and we are bound to fall ill if in consequence of frustration we are unable to love," unquote. But Freud was so uncomfortable sharing this emphasis on the centrality of love with the religions he so hated, that he mostly suppressed this way of speaking, and even here, his valuation of love is merely instrumental, a means to the end of avoiding illness, by no means an end in itself. 15 years later, in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud bluntly rejected and mocked the Christian love command. In his new introductory lectures, Freud argued that psychoanalysis has no other Weltanschauung than that of science itself, and is only interested in, quote, submission to the truth and rejection of illusions, unquote. While acknowledging that in practical life, the making of ultimate value judgments is unavoidable, these are left to the liberty and responsibility of the individual. In this view, psychoanalysis is committed only to what Philip Rieff, well, actually, it was not Philip, it was his wife, as we now know, who wrote that book, Freud, The Mind of the Moralist. I don't think they've started bringing the book out with her name on it, which they should. But anyway, in Freud's view, psychoanalysis is committed only to a penultimate ethic of honesty, restricting itself to helping analysands transcend self-deception. But the idea that psychoanalysis has no ethic other than that of honesty is not honest. At best, it is an illusion, hopefully without a future. For like it or not, where id was, there ego shall be, is a moral imperative, requiring far more than replacing illusion with truth. It enjoins us to transcend impulsive action in favor of delayed gratification and self-control. Sublimation of primitive drive is encouraged. Quotes, it is a work of culture, not unlike the draining of the Zeider Z, unquote. To avoid, quotes, illness, we must transcend narcissism in favor of object love, and to avert self-destruction, we must bind Thanatos with Eros and overcome the harsh, punitive superego that is a, quotes, pure culture of the death instinct, unquote. In these and other ways, the Freudian ethic far exceeds the demand for self-knowledge. While others fail to practice what they preach, we psychoanalysts fail to preach what we practice. We disguise our ethic of love beneath the medical facade. We pretend to promote health over illness rather than goodness over badness. Perhaps some colleagues have comprehended this but chosen to keep up the disguise for strategic reasons. I mean, up in here in Canada, we have socialized medicine. I don't think OHIP in Ontario is going to pay for attempts to convert people from badness to goodness. So probably the medical disguise is practical. My medical colleagues would be in trouble if it was dropped. I think we have mostly lacked either the understanding or the courage to admit who we are and what we are about. Freud championed strict psychic determinism, frequently referring to what he called the illusion of free will, unquote. Even while defining the goal of psychoanalytic therapy as setting us free from inhibitions, symptoms, and compulsive repetitions. Just as some philosophers walk around with deterministic theories in their heads while holding their spouses, children, and perhaps even themselves responsible in a myriad of ways. In our legal systems and our everyday lives, like the Abrahamic religions, we assume free will, guilt, and responsibility. Yet in psychoanalysis, we've sought to obscure the ethical and existential dimensions of our work through resort to a medical discourse that at least appears compatible with determinism. But while physical illness can be defined objectively in terms of biologically built-in norms, our very preference for life over death cannot be justified in this way. It is a subjective choice, and we know that human beings are free to choose to sacrifice their lives in the service of other aims, such as giving birth, going to war, or committing suicide. Similarly, the ethical choices that make up the fabric of our daily lives entail subjective value judgments, whether or not to cheat on our spouses or our taxes, to keep our oath not to reveal state secrets or become a whistleblower, and so on. As psychoanalysts, we know that much of the anxiety and suffering our patients bring to us involves such moral issues. While we should not be superego-ish with our patients, we must nevertheless carry the conscience in the treatment until such time as our patients are able to carry it themselves. All but our most psychopathic patients count on us to have a conscience. And a central ingredient of the conscientious practice of psychoanalysis involves knowing the difference between the conscience and the superego. I'm going to go on to talk about this, but let me first of all say that the distinction between conscience and superego has early roots. I can't speak of other cultural traditions, but certainly Jesus embodies it. He attacks the religious superego of the time in favor of conscience. St. Paul certainly was well aware and wrote of the distinction between the law and the gospel. I was surprised recently to learn that Carl Gustav Jung wrote an essay in 1958 called A Psychological View of Conscience, and Jung nailed this distinction. He was very clear about it. I've never been a big fan of Carl Jung. In fact, I stopped reading him many, many years ago. I'm trying to reverse that now. That man said some brilliant things that we need to know about, but he certainly understood the distinction between conscience and superego. So did Neville Symington, the British Australian author. Erich Fromm tried to get at it with his distinction between authoritarian conscience, superego, and humanistic conscience. Okay, while the superego, as Freud taught us, is composed of id aggression turned against the self, plus the internalization of socially constructed and culturally relative mores, folkways, and laws, the conscience, I've argued, is grounded in our mammalian and primate heritage and the universal norm of reciprocity formed in early attachments and identifications with nurturers, those who kept us alive, and to whom, for this, we are indebted. Early on, Renee Spitz gave us films in which the babe at the breast puts its fingers in mother's mouth as if to feed her back, and later spoons food to her as she does to him. In playgrounds all over the world, children are heard saying, "That's not fair. You had your turn, now it's mine." Freud himself got only half of the universal norm of reciprocity. While Talion law prescribes an eye for an eye, the law of conscience obliges us to return love for love received. The point has seldom been more beautifully put than in Johann Sebastian Bach's Christmas Oratorio, Chorale number 59. Ich steh in deiner Krippen hier, o Jesulein, mein Leben. Ich komme, bring und schenke dir, was du mir hast gegeben. In English, the last two lines read, I come, bring, and give to thee that which thou hast given me. The norm of reciprocity. Regrettably, in The Ego and the Id in 1923, Freud absorbed conscience into superego. Ego, ideal, and conscience were absorbed into the superego, thus obscuring for us the important differences and conflicts between them. As my old friend and mentor Eli Sagan had pointed out in 1988 in his book Freud, Women and Morality, The Psychology of Good and Evil, a much ignored book, but a great book, Eli pointed out that Mark Twain had given us in Huckleberry Finn the classic illustration of this conflict between conscience and superego. Huck is a product of a racist society, and as such, has an immoral, racist superego. As he floats down the Mississippi on a raft with his friend Jim, a runaway slave, he is torn by his superegoic urge to write to Jim's owner, turning him in, and his conscientious desire to protect the friend he loves. He tries to draw up a list of Jim's bad qualities to rationalize turning him in, but he can't come up with any bad qualities. So after much anguish, Huck decides, okay, I'll go to hell, and tears up the letter. Similarly, in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, Javert, the superego personified, is a policeman for whom the law has been the whole of the law, the whole of morality. The law has been the whole of morality. Faced with the existence of a higher moral principle, he commits suicide. It is the demonic superego, composed of id aggression turned back against the self, that threatens us with hell fire, while the conscience, identified with the nurturer, mediates the love that defends us in the face of persecution. Freud's blurring of the difference between superego and conscience parallels his failure to distinguish the two very different types of guilt, persecutory and reparative, as clarified for us by Melanie Klein and Leon Grinberg. If I've injured someone and while he bleeds, I flagellate myself, this is persecutory guilt induced by the superego. But if I drop my cat o' nine tails and grab my first aid kit and start bandaging, that is a reparative act of conscience. In my view, it's unfortunate that mainstream psychoanalysis chose to follow James Strachey's call for the modification of the superego instead of its disempowerment in favor of conscience. In the same vein, Roy Schaefer in 1960 advanced the quite un-Freudian notion of, quotes, a loving and beloved superego, an idea cobbled together from a few occasional, rather offhand comments of Freud's that are in marked contrast to Freud's overall view of the superego as a sadistic agency that needs therapeutic demolition. That word demolition is Freud's word. An essay in 1940, page 180, Freud called for the demolition of the superego. Now, of course, he was completely in contradiction. In his clinical work, he increasingly knew that the superego is the key element of psychopathology. But in his sociological work, he describes the superego as a good cop that saves us from a descent into barbarism. So which is it? Is it a bad cop or a good cop? Freud never really, I think, appreciated this contradiction and didn't really address it. I submit that Roy Schaefer's loving and beloved superego is not the superego at all, but the conscience. In seeking to elaborate this distinction between superego and conscience, I'm urging psychoanalysts to belatedly recognize the difference between law and gospel, a distinction long recognized in theology and in no way to be conflated with the distinction between the so-called Old and New Testaments. For law and conscience, superego and conscience, are to be found in both. Whereas the superego utilizes the law in order to condemn and punish, the conscience, grounded in identification with the nurturer, mediates the love that assists fallible human beings in their never entirely successful struggles to keep the law. And it mediates forgiveness in the face of inevitable failures. Freud himself, together with Franz Alexander and Sándor Ferenczi, viewed the goal of psychoanalysis as the demolition, that's Freud's term, complete elimination, that's Ferenczi's term, of the superego, and transfer of the moral function to the rational ego. Well, I greatly value their desire to disempower the superego, but you can't transfer the moral function to the ego. Because as David Hume, 1739-40, explained in the 18th century, we cannot deduce an ought from an is. Science is descriptive, not prescriptive. While the ego can help us know what is, it cannot tell us what ought to be. This is the domain, the oughts. This is the domain of the superego and the conscience. We clearly need the law, the superego. Now here I'm correcting myself. I went a little overboard for a few years. I got so enthused about Freud's wanting to demolish and Ferenczi's calling for the complete elimination of the superego. I kind of embraced that, and then I kind of came to my senses and realized, no, we can't entirely eliminate the superego. And we need the law, but the law must be subordinated to the authority of conscience. Even if you like Strachey's idea of the modification of the superego, that's no argument against separating conscience back out as a separate function of the mind, because if modification of the superego is our aim, we need conscience to inform us how and in what ways it needs to be modified. In any case, the idea of a complete elimination of the superego is out of sync with Christianity. Matthew 5:17, Christ says, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." It's not a matter of destroying the superego, but it is a matter of disempowering it and subjecting it to discipline by the conscience. Now, some people are really blessed. They have somehow wound up with a superego that pretty much overlaps with the conscience. That is a very sweet place to be. You're getting the right messages from both the superego and the conscience. Well, what happens when some people go to church? I mean, what do they hear? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, your conscience is saying that, and now you're also hearing it at church. That's a pretty good thing. Unfortunately, at church, we also hear a lot of sexist, heterosexist, classist, and other nonsense, racist nonsense. We can't count on the superego to be moral. I wrote a paper called The Immoral Superego. Okay, clinically speaking, I've come to the conclusion that ultimately the only way out of persecution by the sadistic superego is through reconciliation with conscience. Our patients come wrecked by or fearful of success, or criminals from a sense of guilt, or plagued by anxiety or depression, or painful psychosomatic and hysterical conditions, or caught in relationships in which they are bullied or exploited, and so on, all states reflecting the unconscious need for punishment for real and imagined crimes or sins. A good deal of PTSD amounts to, quotes, moral injury, punitive guilt for actions felt to be unforgivable. Beyond the suffering we inflict on ourselves via the tyrannical superego, is that inflicted by others who, unwilling or unable to bear their own guilt, project and induce it in us, their scapegoats. This is the domain in which we work, not moralistically, but conscientiously. While the superego itself is often immoral, loaded with the sadism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, all the ideologies with which we abuse ourselves and one another. On the deepest level, the conscience knows all this is wrong. But unlike the superego, which is always looking for opportunities to flog us, conscience sadly recognizes we are off the path, lovingly yet persistently calls us to return, and joyfully welcomes us when we do. The conscience has a bite. I think of the conscience as a father who, when he reproaches his child who is off the path, the father has tears in his eyes, or the mother has tears in her eyes, because it hurts her to see that her child has gone astray. The superego, on the other hand, is getting off on beating the child. My favorite image of the superego is a fanciful elaboration I made of a scene from Ingmar Bergman's Fanny and Alexander. The father has died, the mother has remarried a very stuffy Lutheran priest, probably not Oscar Pfister type, the other type. And this guy believes, spare the rod, spoil the child, so he beats the children. And I wish Ingmar Bergman had done a close-up on this priest while he's beating the kids, showing that he has an erection. That's a good image for me of a perverse superego. Now, thankfully, not all superegos are perverse like that, but Freud told us the superego is fueled by id hatred, turned back against the self and sometimes inflicted on others. The conscience is like the father in the parable of the prodigal son. He wants us to come back, wants us to come home, and he joyfully welcomes us when we do. On some level, most of us know this is the therapeutic outcome we seek, but we lie to ourselves and others and call it, quotes, mental health, when it really amounts to salvation. This is a concept, salvation, usefully employed in both religious and secular contexts. In Wonder Boys, the 2000 film based on the novel by Michael Chabon, 1995 novel, Wonder Boys, Grady, a lovable but scruffy and pot-addled professor, is unable to complete his rambling, interminable second novel, or to claim the woman he loves and whom he has impregnated. But in the final scene, he appears transformed, neatly groomed, sitting on a laptop in an ordered study, as outside we see his new wife arriving home with the baby. As he types the final sentence of his book, the camera zooms in as "saved" appears on the screen. The artists tell us what we desire, even if we ourselves are reluctant to know or say it out loud. Recognizing the limitations of formal religions and meditative practices in promoting personal transformation, recognizing the limitations of these approaches in bringing about personal transformation, many religious today seek to become psychotherapists. There's widespread interest in mindfulness meditation among psychotherapists, most of whom seem not to recognize that clinical psychoanalysis, in which the analysand is invited to free associate, and the analyst to deploy freely hovering attention, is meditation. It is meditation of a type that moves beyond mindfulness toward heartfulness. But in putting psychoanalysis together in this way with ethics, meditation, spirituality, and religion, am I not ignoring that it has traditionally been associated with enlightenment, rationalism, materialism, and atheism? Personally speaking, I have, for most of my life, struggled with the tension between my early education in the Anglican Episcopal faith and my later commitment to the Enlightenment, quotes, tradition of suspicion. Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Jean-Paul Sartre. For some years, torn by this tension, I found refuge in the demythologizing approach of Rudolf Bultmann, Paul Tillich, and Northrop Frye, which recovers the existential insight and wisdom of the New Testament as metaphor. And in the religionless Christianity of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and other varieties of secular Christianity. By the way, in this connection, it is always, people used to say, Don, you call yourself an atheist, yet you're clearly a pretty passionate Christian. How do you, that struck them as bizarre. But it has always struck me as odd and unfair that psychoanalysts who have no problem understanding that Sigmund Freud was both an atheist and yet a proud Jew find it hard to credit that someone like Jacques Lacan could be both an atheist and a proud Catholic. Anyway, that's an aside. In recent years, these demythologizing secular perspectives have come to seem excessively dry, rationalistic, and out of touch with the reality of my far more emotional right hemisphere spirituality. In The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Modern World, Ian McGilchrist describes the unbalanced civilization created by left hemispheric dominance in the West. I like to think that lately I am becoming more balanced, more honest, more Christian, and more deeply Freudian, all at the same time. After all, Freud's fundamental discovery is that we are all, at the very least, double, split between conscious and unconscious, manifest and latent, secondary process and primary process. For Melanie Klein, we inhabit both the depressive reparative and the paranoid schizoid positions forever. These are not stages, these are positions. We oscillate. We are all both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. For it is not as if the primary process disappears when the secondary is active, not as if the unconscious disappears when the conscious dominates, nor do paranoid schizoid mental processes, splitting, projection, omnipotence, magical thinking disappear when depressive reparative dynamics, enhanced reality testing, ambivalence, whole self and object relations, and the capacity for concern for the other momentarily predominate. For Freud, Klein, Wilfred Bion, Hans Lowald, Thomas Ogden, and others, however much we may develop and integrate, we remain divided, progressing and regressing, oscillating between PS and D. But my main point here is not about oscillating. The more important point is that I've come to recognize the splitting entailed in conceiving development as a one-way advance from PS to D. Turns out, that there is bad as well as good in D, and good as well as bad in PS. The ambivalence attained in D can become excessively dispassionate, even paralyzing. I mean, seeing all sides to every question makes you unable to act. And where would we be without the fine madness entailed in falling in love, which happens in the paranoid schizoid position, at least for a time? Where would we be without the fine madness entailed in falling in love, or the willingness of soldiers to kill and be killed in the fight against fascism? Just as an excessively dispassionate rationality can be maladaptive, so splitting is adaptive in the face of a predator. I have a colleague who wrote a wonderful paper called In Defense of Splitting. Do you think he can get it published? No. Part of our current ideology is splitting is bad. You know, that wasn't Melanie Klein's view. Melanie Klein thought that splitting, acquiring the capacity to split, saves us from psychosis. If you can't hold the bad as bad and the good as good, then you're into this crazy state where the good is always turning bad and the bad is always turning good, and it's chaos. So we advance into splitting. Now we can hold good and bad separately. Well, we need to overcome that now because we're borderline now. We need to move on to achieve ambivalence, of course, but splitting has gotten a very bad, an excessively bad name in psychoanalysis. Splitting is adaptive in the face of a predator. As both Ernst Kreis and Hans Lowald remind us, sometimes regression in the service of the ego, sometimes regression is in the service of the ego. Growth and creativity sometimes require rediscovery of our rootedness in the infantile and the unconscious. While the pessimistic older Freud regarded the id as, quotes, a chaos, a cauldron of seething excitations, unquote, in his most creative early work, he viewed it as ordered by the laws of the primary process that creatively generate dreams, parapraxes, symptoms, and transferences that often speak truths that the ego is desperate to censor. Hasn't been observed often enough, this change from an early, more liberal, even radical at times perspective to a very conservative view in Freud's later work. Early on, the unconscious had order. In 1933, it was a chaos, a dangerous, threatening chaos, a witch's brew. Think of the cauldron, you know, snakes, frogs, the witches. That's his later view of the unconscious. That's not where he was in his most creative period. There's no doubt some validity, I think considerable validity, in Erich Fromm's distinction between authoritarian and humanistic religion, as in Neville Symington's differentiation between primitive and mature types of spirituality, no doubt we can categorize some religion, spirituality, and mysticism as PS and some as D, but it is essential to recognize the strengths and weaknesses in each. While PS religion may involve superstition and magical ritualism, for example, rounding up some virgins to throw into the volcano, dancing to make it rain, or including the names of sick or dying parishioners in the prayers of the people on Sunday, it can also generate passion, love, hope, and community. And while D religion may be more rational and reality-oriented, it can be excessively intellectualized, dispassionate, and closed off from the terror, awe, and mystery of intense religious experience. We can usefully extend Fromm's distinction between authoritarian and humanistic religion to psychoanalysis itself. We all know how authoritarian psychoanalysis has sometimes been, and then the swing to much more humanistic versions of psychoanalysis. But even the most humanistic among us should strive to recognize some of the strengths of the older, more classical approaches, together with the weaknesses and excesses of the reformers. In my recent 2018 book, I argue in favor of a dialectical comparative psychoanalysis that seeks through dialogue among the various paradigms, dare I say, denominations, to evolve a higher order understanding that seeks to integrate the strengths of each. Just as religion sometimes takes the form of empty ritualism, so psychoanalysis can amount to ritualistically lying on a couch 4 or 5 times a week, as if verbalizing in the presence of a certified analyst operating with the sanctified theory will lead to enlightenment. Nevertheless, sometimes psychoanalysis, religion, spirituality, and mysticism can actually bring about what Bion called transformations in O. O being defined as ultimate reality, absolute truth, the Godhead, the infinite, the thing in itself, unquote. Transformations in O move far beyond insight or self-knowledge. They involve change on the level of being, not merely that of knowing. It is quite possible to know all about one's character defects while continuing to enact them. As the old story goes, before my 10-year classical analysis, I was a real SOB. I'm still an SOB, but now I know why. My point here is not to devalue classical or any other kind of analysis, but only to point out that just as religious practices often lead to little or only superficial personality change, so psychoanalytic therapies often fail to result in fundamental structural change. In my view, progress in psychoanalysis is irreducible to an advance from PS to D. It has to move beyond both to what I refer to as PSD and James Grotstein called the transcendent position, a kind of transitional area. I realize I'm echoing things that our speakers this morning had also underlined. Grotstein's transcendent position, a kind of transitional area where in moments of grace, one may temporarily synthesize the passionate intensity of PS with the realism, balance, and symmetry of D. This is the kind of God spot I have encountered in love, in beautifully conducted Anglo-Catholic services, and in blues joints in Chicago and Toronto when a band finds itself momentarily and joyfully in the groove. Those moments can only last a certain period of time, and then the musicians sort of put down their instruments and start laughing because they know they had it, but of course they couldn't hold it because they got it because it was a moment of grace. You find the God spot. You can't hold it, but periodically we can find ourselves there if we practice. Most of the time, I do my best to be realistic, to take science seriously, to forgo superstition and magical thinking, but I can no longer deny that I am double, that I live in both PS and D, open to input from both hemispheres. Before my recent surgery, and for a time afterward, I found myself praying again. Every year when I go to hear Messiah, I weep like a child. When the PSA test starts rising again, you might see me back at St. Mary Magdalene lighting candles. I generally do the work of loving my wife in D, in the depressive position, but thanks be to God, I frequently fall back into PS love with her. While there are certainly truths that are important to face in the depressive position, death, loss, the need for mourning, etc., it seems there are other truths, including truths of the heart, that may only be realized in the paranoid schizoid position. So, do I believe in God or don't I? In the past, I would have said it depends on what you mean by that word, G-O-D. Provided you give the term a secular meaning, such as Paul Tillich's ultimate concern, then yes, I can believe in that, if that's what you mean by God. But if you mean a supernatural being, then no. That's what I would have said in the past. But today, things are more complicated. Today, I have something more than definitions in mind when I answer that I do and I do not, and proceed to quote Mark 9:24, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Unquote. Freud, the brilliant explorer of human contradictoriness, remained ashamed of his superstitions and numerological preoccupations, Kabbalah. He and many of his followers seem to believe we should be consistent and integrated beings, unitary selves, when our own science, psychoanalysis, shows we are not. I'm trying to acknowledge and bear my contradiction. Although it is foolishness to the Greeks, and even to the rationalist in me, it seems nevertheless to simply be the case that I regard Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. Allow me to conclude by addressing the question posed in the original title of this symposium. Are psychoanalysis and religion, spirituality compatible? Insofar as they both recognize that human beings are profoundly split, Christ versus old Adam, Eros versus Thanatos, ego versus id, conscience versus superego. And insofar as they both surrender omnipotent ideals of integration, mean, the best we can do is kind of oscillate. We can't integrate. Insofar as they both do that, they are parallel approaches to therapeutic transformation. Like the human beings they strive to help, they are themselves split and must strive to combine the vitality and passion of PS with the reason, conscience, and concern of D. But in seeking this higher order synthesis, PSD, or the transcendent position, they at the same time must recognize that such integration is only attainable by permanently imperfect, fallen human beings in moments of grace, only achievable in moments of grace. Both religion and psychoanalysis perpetually fall short of their ideals. It turns out that Jean Vanier, founder of the L'Arche communities around the world for seriously handicapped people, whom many expected to be sainted a few years after his death, turns out he was an abuser. One of his books is called The Broken Body. I am no more dismayed by the revelation of his brokenness than by that of another abuser, the founder of the Toronto Psychoanalytic Society. Both of these men did many bad things and many good things. They were contradictory and challenge us to see both sides instead of splitting. Psychoanalysis and religion have a shared diagnosis and prescription for what Freud called our human malaise. Our human malaise, namely narcissism and its transcendence through love. Both the Abrahamic religions and psychoanalysis share this value, the overcoming of narcissism, sin of pride, self-centeredness, overcoming that in favor of what Freud called object love. Here he is in sync with the Abrahamic religions, but he didn't want to be in sync with the Abrahamic religions. This should make them mutually respectful allies instead of enemies. But for this rapprochement to be realized, psychoanalysis must more fully appreciate and bear the contradictoriness it reveals, and it must learn to appreciate gospel as well as law. It must recover its conscience. Thank you.